Hi, it's LS, and this video is going to be talking about the most recent topic that was brought up on Reddit, which is Riot preventing snowballs in League and the boring current patch that we're on, or the meta that we're on. Something that you might have seen me tweet about was that there is no boring patch, there is no boring meta, there's no way to fix it, and Riot's not really to blame. Now, a lot of people, what they're doing is they're attributing the changes that Riot has made over the last few years that has slowed down the progression of, getting a solo kill and translating it into a very big lead, and there's no more bloody fights happening, there's no more chaos, there's no more havoc, and, some people are attributing that to the Dragon change, other people are attributing it to HP on towers, other people are attributing it to the Trinket changes that came out, I think, in Season 4. And other people are even attributing it to just, champions that have come out and, they're too mobile, they have too much disengage, they have too much utility inside of their kits, and you just can't really do anything about it. And so they're all throwing this blame onto Riot. But you see, the problem with that is that it's completely ignorant. And the way that we know that it's ignorant is because you can look at other games historically, in eSports and even outside of eSports. Most notably, we're going to look at chess. If you look at the progression from chess, or another even more advanced game, Go, the board game that's very popular in mostly the Asian countries, you'll notice that if you look back at the very beginning of those games' lives, there was a lot more chaos. There was a lot more randomness. Stuff had not been solved. Stuff had not been, figured out, like how to open, how to develop certain things. And similarly, like in all video games that come out, StarCraft 1, StarCraft 2, I talk about this all the time, generally at the very early stages of a game's life, there's a lot of chaos because not a lot of people know what's going on and how to properly play and why are we doing the things that we're doing. And so what ends up happening is you have these players that generally excel during that stage because they're much more adept at figuring out answers to certain problems that are arising relatively quickly. And always at the very beginning, generally game timers are much less than they are in the later stages. If you look at StarCraft 1 or StarCraft 2 game timers very early on in the game's lives, you can notice that the games were ending at 15 to 18 minutes, and that was considered a normal game. Nowadays, we have long macro fests that go on 35 to 40 minutes, and yes, there's been patches obviously in between, but it's not because of anything that Blizzard is necessarily doing. And this is something that I talk about where if you consider that a Season 2 or a Season 1 player would be around Diamond 5 level, or maybe even mid-Platinum if we're using North America or Europe West skill measurement as a tool to judge, how good were those players. We look at them now, players of that level, and we realize how much they're still missing in terms of knowledge. Ward control, positioning inside a laning phase, damage foresight, they don't necessarily know exactly how a trade is going to go. And they don't know how to ward, when to recall. They have all these problems. And as you keep climbing up and up and up the ladder, you start noticing that these little nuances that separate certain players and break apart different skill tiers and gaps, you'll notice that they begin to gradually and slowly disappear as the players get more and more refined and crisp with their play overall. So what happens now is if you take modern day pros and you bring them back to the glory days where everyone claims that there was no problem with League, it was fun to watch, Zed versus Orianna, Ahri versus Karthus, Karthus versus Orianna, you have Lee Sin in the jungle, you have Jarvan in the jungle, all this chaos is happening all the time. If you take current day professionals and you bring them back in time, like a legacy match, the game is not going to change. In fact, if you would have identical teams, if somehow you could have the players be modern day professional level, and you could take the same exact teams and put them in identical scenarios, you would notice that things that they would have done years ago, they're no longer going to do. You're not going to have Zeds randomly going aggressive and getting lucky simply because the jungler wasn't there, but that's mostly because he's not even considering the jungler. Back then, counting timers was something that was somehow glorified, especially in Korea. Korean supports and Korean junglers were, held a tier above the rest. They were exalted for their ability to keep timers and tabs on summoner spells, jungle camps, because that didn't used to exist, and all these other little nuances. But this wasn't something that was out of the realm of human possibility. This wasn't something that Riot necessarily needed to add, because obviously there were already professionals that were beginning to slowly implement that into their play anyway. But what ends up happening is people like to blame Riot for adding jungle camp timers. They like to blame Riot for adding HP to the turrets and all this other stuff. But honestly, in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't have anything to do with why is the game boring by a spectator's standards. And that's mostly just because people got better. People understood, hey, I can't actually go in here. Hey, this would actually be a bad idea to trade. A lot of the kills that happened in Season 2, Season 3, Season 4 was because players lacked damage foresight. You wouldn't look at a current Diamond 5 player or a current Platinum 3 or even a Diamond 3, Diamond 1 even, Masters, and you see them all the time in solo queue. They make mistakes, they go for a trade, and then the trade ends up being really bad. Well, back then, it was even worse than it is now. So then, factor that in. Factor in that junglers didn't even really have roots. Factor in that leashing was sort of a foreign concept to the extent that we have it today. Factor in that lane swaps didn't really exist until, when was it, Season 3, I think? And that's such an advanced concept that even to this day, people continue to mess up because it's still evolving. It's still growing and having an evolution. And if you look at modern day chess and you compare it to the very early stages of chess, you wouldn't think that a pro like Bobby Fischer would even hold a candle to Magnus Carlsen, in today's chess world. Even if they were to play a standard match of chess, Magnus Carlsen would just be on a completely different level. And so is that necessarily boring because players just evolved, they figured out stuff, they learned how to adapt? Is it boring that professional players whose lives are at stake are not willing to risk and throw up coins, although sometimes they do that at Baron, let's be honest. But it's not, this isn't Riot's fault. This has nothing to do with Riot, and Riot can't fix this, because what ends up happening is the longer that a game exists, the longer that it continues to thrive, the more people that start going, okay, there's more ways to approach this game than just physically going into it and trying to muscle your way into improving. What ends up happening is you get analysts, you get coaches, you get people who are devoted to trying to break down the minutia surrounding the game. And when that starts happening, all of the secrets, all of the darkness, and everything else that is hidden still inside of League that maybe professional teams and players haven't figured out yet, they begin to get figured out. They begin to get solved. And when that information begins to trickle into the public and it begins to trickle into solo queue and into all the pro teams and stuff, you experience an evolution of the game. And when that happens, that doesn't go away. And the reason for this is because that is a core fundamental to League of Legends. It has nothing to do with the meta. It has nothing to do with the patch. In fact, the only time where chaos generally tends to happen, if you look at it, is at the beginning of a season, when preseason comes out and there's a giant shakeup in all of the champions, giant shakeup in the mastery trees, giant shakeup in the itemization. And is that something that you really want when you're a professional player? Do you want Riot to constantly morph the entire face of the game, almost making it unrecognizable every 2 to 3 weeks, just so it's a little bit more exciting for the public? Even then, it doesn't mean that solo kills are going to happen. The reason that solo kills are so glorified right now in professional play is because players got so adept at understanding how to play the lane phase. Back in Season 3, Flame, one of the best top laners in the world, even the champion of the terminology, Flame Horizon, used to be so good at controlling a minion wave that other top laners couldn't compete because Flame had such an understanding on how to position himself inside of the lane and attack minions to gain a small advantage periodically over the duration of the laning phase, ultimately suffocating his opponent. This is something that is almost common, and you have to know it to be a top laner in today's world. And yes, there is still going to be exceptions. You have Faker in Korea, you have Bjergsen in NA, you have other people who can try to challenge their throne. Jensen in mid lane in Korea, you have multiple mid laners that Faker is no longer Faker, but that's not because he's gotten worse. Obviously, the Faker now is better than the Faker of, yesteryear, but the game has evolved. Players have evolved. Everyone has evolved and gotten better. This has nothing to do with Riot. And so when you sit there and you claim that the game is boring and the patch is boring, nothing can be done unless you're going to morph the entire game. And what I mean by morph the entire game is you add either a component that does not currently exist, and what I mean by that is maybe a third neutral objective or something, or you completely change the dynamic in which the current founding principles of the game operate. And what I mean by that is you change how minions interact, or you change how minions give gold, or maybe you add something where you can deny CS, and that's a complex mechanic. Maybe you add, I don't even know what you could add. Maybe you could add a terrain obstruction, or you can add mechanics that are not currently in the game. Other than that, and even when and if that would ever be added, it's going to get solved, and it's going to get figured out. And when it gets figured out, and when it gets solved, you're going to be complaining the same old story over and over. But you have to understand that these are professional players whose lives are on the line. Their income, their career is hanging on the line, and it's not to entertain you. They don't want to try to go for those solo kills. Not because they wouldn't enjoy a solo kill, but because it's so hard to actually orchestrate and pull off solo kills inside of the laning phase nowadays, because everyone, the difference in skill between players, even though it can seem somewhat very obvious when you compare certain top laners or certain mid laners, certain AD carries, certain supports, because League of Legends is ultimately a team game, and especially on the professional level, it's more so a team game, it's very difficult to coordinate or to be able to execute your skill or use it over someone inside of a professional setting, because there's all these other components. Some people, like I mentioned earlier, like to attribute the implementation of trinkets, making it much more difficult to solo kill people, because now people get free wards early on. But I would like to bring up how in Season 3 and Season 4, what did support start opening? You had some supports, especially in Asia, opening with multiple wards, and everyone would just give wards to certain lanes. The same thing would happen. Now, what could you do to prevent that? Well, green wards are out of the game, so if you take away trinkets, then yeah, there's going to be a little bit more fog of war. But do you think that'll really change too much? What will end up happening is probably jungle paths will change a little bit. They'll evolve a little bit to be a little bit more defensive for their top, mid, and bottom laners. And then on top of that, maybe top and mid laners change to adapt to the fact that you need to be a little bit more durable, or you need to be a little bit more safe, or people would just learn how to play out the laning phase a little bit differently. And then on top of that, they would learn the absolute clear speeds, or the absolute best possible clear speeds of certain junglers to prevent themselves from getting ganked. There's no way to fix this. This isn't Riot's fault. Blaming Riot isn't going to do anything. The only thing that we can maybe hope for is, again, a metamorphosis of the game, or things added that currently just don't exist, or the things that currently do exist, again, need to get completely changed into being something else, or something needs to happen. Making Dragon give gold again, it's not going to do anything. Would you have maybe some more team fights at the first or second Dragon? Would there be maybe a little bit more contention in the earlier stages of the game? Absolutely. But are you going to contest and throw the game over 190 gold to each player? No, you're not. Because we've already seen that players are now beginning to understand and learn how to survive and sustain against 5, 6k, 7k gold deficits. That's something that the old Dragon used to give you. The old Dragon used to give you basically a recipe component over the enemy team inside of team fights, and that's why it was so monstrous for your team to have. Nowadays, that's obviously still something that's very important to have, but it's not as impactful as it once was. But it has nothing to do with Riot. And if you can't even blame pro players, because again, it's their lives. This is what's supposed to happen. So a lot of people are complaining that viewership and all this other stuff is somehow being affected by this, but I think that there's a lot of other scenarios that are coming into play and that are affecting people, and obviously there's some people that are over-exaggerating, and there's some people that are overreacting to certain situations. And you also really have to just take into the fact that League is getting older. And there's always the possibility that League maybe gets revamped. And what I mean by that is we saw it with Dota and maybe Dota 2. There's a very real possibility that League of Legends 2 does come out, and I think that's something that people don't really entertain. And if that does come out, maybe there's new mechanics that get added, or maybe there's new mechanics that get added in Season 7. Maybe there's even something else that gets done to LCS. Maybe Riot changes up something for solo queue. I think one of the most defining factors that is starting to begin to cause problems in NA and EU is the fact that solo queue over the years no longer means anything. If you want to complain about anything, or you want to, tirade at Riot for something, I think the best thing to complain about currently is the solo queue has become a lot less competitive. And if you want the game to start meaning anything, and talent and other stuff, I think that your rating on the ladder should mean something. It should no longer be brushed off if you're capable of getting challenger. It should no longer be mocked at because you get top 50 using dynamic queue. Getting rank 1 used to mean something, and it doesn't anymore. And that's where I feel like one of the biggest problems is. But anyways, I hope that this helped explain some stuff. And, again, look at StarCraft 1. Look at the very beginning when players used to just play on 1 or 2 bases. And now look at StarCraft 1 16 years later. In 2016, it's still going strong. There's not a game that almost isn't a macro slugfest. And the games that do have micro-intensive battles early on, they're generally calculated gambles used based on the best of X series between certain players. That's it. You can't change that. So I hope that explains some stuff.